He gave his father every breath he had left, and still his brother treated him like a stranger. For weeks Caleb Miller had not slept through a single night. While the old farmhouse creaked in the warm Mississippi wind, he sat beside his dying father Henry Miller, wiping sweat from his forehead, changing his sheets, feeding him spoonfuls of broth when his hands were too weak to lift. Caleb was only 30, but grief had carved years into his face. His beard had grown rough. His eyes were hollow. His hands, cracked from years of ranch work, rested on his knees as he watched the man who had taught him everything slowly disappear. Across the hall, the house was quiet. Too quiet. His older brother Richard had not been there for the sleepless nights. He had not heard their father coughing until his chest shook. He had not cleaned the room, called the doctor, or held the old man's hand when the pain became too much. Richard lived in the city. He called only when it suited him. And lately his calls had carried one question beneath every word. Was the old man gone yet? Then just before sunset a black car rolled through the ranch gate. Richard stepped out in polished shoes and a dark suit, carrying a bottle of expensive liquor nobody had asked for. He walked into the sick room without greeting Caleb. He looked at his father for 3 seconds. Then he asked coldly, "He's still alive?" Caleb said nothing. He only took his father's trembling hand and stayed. The moment Richard asked, "He's still alive," the room seemed to tighten around Caleb's chest. Henry Miller's eyes had been half closed for hours, lost somewhere between fever and memory. But at the sound of Richard's voice, the old man stirred. His lips moved, but no words came out. Caleb leaned closer, thinking his father needed water. Richard stayed standing at the foot of the bed, his polished shoes planted on the worn wooden floor like he already owned every board beneath him. Outside, somewhere near the porch, the old black dog gave a low whine. Shadow had been lying there all evening, stretched beside the screen door with his gray muzzle resting on his paws. Nobody knew exactly how long that dog had been on the ranch. Some said he showed up when Caleb was just a boy. Others said Henry had brought him home one stormy night and never explained why. But one thing was certain: Henry loved that animal with a devotion nobody in the family understood. At times it almost seemed like he trusted Shadow more than he trusted his own blood. Caleb heard the dog scratch softly at the door. Henry heard it too. The old man's fingers twitched against the blanket, his eyes opened just enough to search the room. First they found Richard. There was no warmth there. No relief. Only a tired sadness, as if Henry could see straight through the suit, the city manners, the expensive bottle of liquor, and into the greed waiting underneath. Then his eyes moved to Caleb. Everything in Henry's face changed. His breathing was shallow, broken, but the fear in his eyes sharpened into purpose. With all the strength left in his body, he lifted one trembling hand toward Caleb. Caleb took it at once. "I'm here, Dad," he whispered. "I'm right here." Henry's mouth opened. The words came out thin and cracked, barely louder than the wind pressing against the old window. "Shadow." Caleb bent closer. "What about him?" Henry swallowed hard. His throat worked like every syllable cost him pain. "Take care of Shadow." Caleb glanced toward the door. The dog scratched again, slow and steady, like he knew his name had been spoken. "He's right outside," Caleb said gently. "Don't worry. I'll look after him." But Henry's grip tightened. Not much. He no longer had much strength. But enough to make Caleb understand this was not a simple request. "No," Henry breathed. "Don't leave him." Richard's eyes narrowed. Caleb felt it before he saw it, the change in the room, the sharp silence from his brother's side of the bed. Henry pulled Caleb's hand closer to his chest. His voice broke, but the words were clear enough to split the night open. "It's in him." Caleb froze. "What's in him, Dad?" Henry tried to answer. His lips trembled. His chest rose once hard, then fell. A cough tore through him, deep and painful, stealing whatever truth he had almost spoken. Caleb leaned over him, panic rising. "Dad, please." "What do you mean?" But Henry only stared at him, pleading without strength, as if the secret had reached the edge of his tongue and fallen back into the dark. Behind Caleb, Richard said nothing. But his face had changed. For one quick second the mask slipped. Something cold flashed in his eyes, not confusion, not grief. Fear. Then Henry's fingers loosened. Caleb held on tighter, whispering that everything would be all right, even though he knew it would not. That night at 2 a.m, Henry Miller died with Caleb's hand wrapped around his own. And outside the bedroom door, Shadow kept scratching. 3 days after Henry Miller died, the whole world seemed to move on except Caleb. The sun still rose over the pastures. The cattle still gathered near the fence line. The wind still pushed through the cottonwoods behind the old farmhouse. But to Caleb, every sound on that land felt different now. His father's cough was gone. His voice was gone. Even the floorboards outside the sick room seemed too quiet without Shadow scratching at the door. Caleb buried Henry on a gray morning beside the little country church where his mother had been laid to rest years before. Richard stood near the grave in a dark coat, checking his watch twice when he thought no one was looking. Caleb saw it. So did Sarah his wife, but neither of them spoke. Their 14-year-old son Ethan stood between them with red eyes and clenched fists, trying to be a man too early. After the funeral, they were told to come to Mr. Walker's office in town for the reading of the will. The office smelled like old paper, stale coffee, and polished wood. Framed certificates hung crooked on the walls. Caleb sat with Sarah on one side of the room. Ethan sat beside him, holding a small notebook against his chest like it was the only thing keeping him steady. Richard arrived 5 minutes late. No apology. No grief. Just the smooth step of a man walking into a room where he expected to win. Mr. Walker cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and opened the folder in front of him. Caleb lowered his eyes. He did not expect much. He had never cared about being rich. He had never measured his love for that ranch in acres or dollars. But he had worked that land since he was old enough to carry a feed bucket. He had fixed fences in the rain, pulled calves from frozen mud, repaired tractors with bleeding hands, and stayed with his father until the very end. Surely some part of it would remain with him. Then Mr. Walker began to read. The farmhouse, the barns, the cattle, the equipment, the land stretching from the creek bed to the north ridge, every field Caleb had planted, every fence post he had driven into the earth, every building his sweat had helped keep standing. All of it went to Richard Miller. The room went silent. Sarah's face lost its color. Ethan's fingers tightened around the notebook until the edges bent beneath his grip. Caleb did not move. He stared at one dark knot in the wooden floor and forced himself to breathe. Then Mr. Walker read the final line. To my younger son Caleb Miller, I leave my dog Shadow. That was all. Not the house where he had nursed his father through his final nights. Not 1 acre of land. Not 1 cow. Not 1 machine. Only an old black dog with gray around his muzzle and tired legs. Richard leaned back in his chair, unable to hide the smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. Well, he said softly, just loud enough for Caleb to hear, looks like Dad knew exactly what you were worth. Sarah turned toward the attorney. Her voice was quiet, but her hands were trembling in her lap. Are you sure this is what Henry signed? Mr. Walker did not meet her eyes for long. It is signed and witnessed, he said. Legally this is his final will. Richard stood then, already wearing the ranch like a crown. Caleb rose slowly. He picked up his hat from the chair beside him. He did not beg. He did not shout. He did not give Richard the satisfaction of seeing him break. He only looked at the paper, then at his brother, and finally toward the window where somewhere beyond town, Shadow was waiting. And for the first time, Caleb wondered if his father's final gift had not been an insult at all. Caleb left the attorney's office with Shadow's leash wrapped loosely around his hand, though the old dog barely needed it. Shadow walked beside him slowly, his black coat dull beneath the afternoon sun, his gray muzzle pointed toward the ground. Every few steps he looked up at Caleb as if he understood more than any animal should. Sarah held Ethan close as they crossed the street. None of them spoke on the ride back to the ranch. The truck rattled over the dirt road past the same fields Caleb had worked since childhood, past the fence post he had set with his father, past the barn roof he had patched after the summer storm 2 years before. All of it looked familiar. And suddenly none of it belonged to him. When they reached the small house near the edge of the property, Sarah went straight to the kitchen. She stood there for a moment with her flour-dusted hands resting on the counter, staring at nothing. Ethan dropped his notebook on the table and walked outside without a word. Caleb did what he always did when life became too heavy. He went to work. He found a broken section of fence near the corral, picked up his tools, and started repairing it. The steady sound of hammer against wood gave his mind something to hold on to. 1 nail, 1 breath, 1 board at a time. Then the sound of tires came up the road. Caleb stopped swinging the hammer. A black pickup rolled toward the house, kicking dust behind it. Richard stepped out first, still wearing his city shoes, though now they were covered with ranch dirt. 2 unfamiliar men climbed out after him. They were broad-shouldered, silent, and looked around the property like they had already been paid not to ask questions. Richard did not look at the broken fence. He did not look at the house where Sarah had cooked for Henry in his final days. He looked straight at Caleb. I need this place cleared out by sundown, Richard said. Caleb stared at him. What? This house, Richard said, waving one hand toward it like it was an old shed. I'm bringing in a new foreman. He'll need somewhere to stay. Sarah stepped onto the porch, wiping her hands on a towel. Her face went pale when she saw the 2 men behind Richard. Richard, she said carefully, Henry was buried 3 days ago. Richard shrugged. And the ranch has a new owner. Ethan came around the side of the house, his jaw tight. This is our home. Richard turned to him with a cold little smile. Not anymore. Caleb took 1 slow step forward. Not enough to threaten. Just enough to stand between his family and his brother. Where are we supposed to go tonight? Caleb asked. Richard's eyes stayed flat. That's not my problem. The words landed harder than a slap. Sarah pressed one hand over her mouth. Ethan's eyes filled with anger, but Caleb lifted his palm slightly, warning him not to speak. Not now. Not to this man. Not when Richard had papers, hired hands, and the law sitting comfortably in his pocket. Shadow stood beside Caleb and growled. Low, old, but clear. For the first time that afternoon, Richard's confidence flickered. His eyes dropped to the dog, then moved back to Caleb. Take your inheritance with you, Richard said. And make sure that ugly old thing doesn't come back. Caleb looked at the house. Then at the fields. Then at Sarah and Ethan, who were watching him as if his next breath would decide whether they broke or held together. He swallowed the fire in his throat. We'll pack, he said. Richard smiled. But Caleb's hand closed around Shadow's leash. And deep inside him, beneath the humiliation, beneath the grief, one thought began to rise. His father had not left him nothing. He had left him a reason to stay alive long enough to find the truth. By sundown, everything Caleb Miller owned fit into the back of one old pickup. A suitcase with 2 broken latches. A cardboard box of family pictures. Sarah's worn Bible. Ethan's school books. A few folded shirts. A pair of work boots with dried mud still clinging to the soles. That was all a lifetime had become. Caleb stood in the doorway of the small house and took one last look inside. The kitchen table where Sarah had rolled biscuits every Sunday morning. The wall where Ethan's height had been marked in pencil since he was 5. The narrow bedroom where Caleb had collapsed after long days in the fields, always believing that if a man worked hard enough the ground beneath him would stay loyal. Now the ground had been taken from him. Richard stood near the gate with his arms crossed, watching like a landlord waiting for strangers to leave. The 2 hired men leaned against the truck behind him, silent and still. They did not need to speak. Their presence was the message. Ethan came out carrying a shovel. Not for packing. For anger. His face was red. His hands were shaking around the handle. Dad, he said, his voice low and burning, we can't just walk away. Caleb turned slowly. Put it down. He stole everything. I said put it down. Ethan's eyes filled, but not with fear. With the helpless rage of a boy old enough to understand injustice and too young to know what it can cost. Grandpa wouldn't have wanted this. You worked this ranch your whole life. You stayed. You took care of him. Uncle Richard didn't do anything. Caleb stepped closer and placed one hand over the shovel handle. I know. Then why are we leaving? Because Richard wanted him to explode. Caleb could feel it as clearly as he could feel the evening heat pressing against his shirt. His brother was waiting for one wrong move, one shout, one raised fist, one moment, ugly enough to turn Caleb from victim into trespasser. Richard had the papers. Richard had the attorney. Richard had men standing behind him. And now Richard wanted the law too. Caleb looked past Ethan toward the big house on the hill. Then he looked at his son. Because fighting him right here in his yard under his rules with his papers and his witnesses won't get us justice, Caleb said quietly. It'll only give him another reason to take what little we have left. Ethan swallowed hard. So we do nothing. No, Caleb said. We think first. Those words seemed small. But they held the weight of everything Caleb was forcing himself not to do. Sarah came out last carrying a bundle wrapped in a checkered tablecloth. Her eyes were red but her back was straight. She had cried while packing. Caleb knew it. He had heard her in the bedroom trying to make no sound. But now she stood beside him with the calm of a woman who had decided she would not let humiliation raise her child. Shadow limped down from the porch and pressed his old body against Caleb's leg. Richard laughed softly from the gate. Don't forget the prize inheritance, he called. That dog's about all you're worth now. Caleb did not answer. Ethan's grip tightened again, but Caleb gave him one look, and the boy lowered his eyes. That was the hardest part of being a father in that moment, not swallowing his own anger but teaching his son to swallow his without letting it poison him. They walked down the dirt road together. Caleb in front, Sarah beside him, Ethan close behind Shadow, moving slow but steady at Caleb's heel. Behind them, Richard remained at the gate, arms crossed, watching them leave the only home they had ever known. For a long time nobody spoke. The ranch faded behind them. The sky turned copper. Long shadows stretched across the road like dark hands reaching for their feet. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. It isn't right, Dad. Caleb kept walking. No, son. It isn't. Can it really be legal? I don't know. Then why does he get to act like it is? Caleb stopped. He turned back once, just once, and looked at the rooftops of the ranch glowing under the last light of evening. His father had died in that house. His brother now slept under that roof. And somewhere inside all of this was a secret tied to an old black dog who refused to leave his side. I don't know if Richard won today because he was right, Caleb said. I only know he won because he was ready. Sarah touched his arm. Then we get ready too. Caleb looked at her. For the first time that day, something steadier than grief moved through him. Not hope yet. Not peace. But direction. Mr. Whitaker lives past the dry creek, Sarah said softly. Your father always said if we ever needed help we could go to him. Caleb nodded. The old man had worked beside Henry for decades. He knew the ranch before Caleb was born. If anyone understood the past, maybe it was him. Shadow lifted his head at the sound of the name, his yellow eyes catching the last strip of sunlight. Caleb noticed. And a chill passed through him. All right, he said. We go to Mr. Whitaker. Then the four of them kept walking into the dark, carrying almost nothing. Except the dog. Except the warning. Except the first quiet spark of a truth Richard Miller had not buried deep enough. The road to Mr. Whitaker's place was narrow, dry, and half swallowed by weeds. Caleb had walked it before as a boy, usually beside his father, usually with tools in his hands and dust on his boots. Back then the path had felt ordinary. Just another dirt road cutting through scrub brush and creek stone. But that evening, with his wife carrying their last bundle of food, his son walking behind him in silence, and Shadow limping at his side, the road felt like the edge of the world. They crossed the dry creek just as the last color faded from the sky. Beyond it stood a small, weathered cabin with a sagging porch, a tin roof, and one yellow light burning in the window. Smoke curled from the chimney in a thin gray line. The place was not much to look at, but to Caleb, after losing everything in one day, that little light looked like mercy. Mr. Samuel Whitaker was sitting outside on a wooden bench sharpening a pocket knife against a stone. He was 78 years old, thin as a fence rail, with white hair combed straight back and hands that looked carved from old oak. He had worked beside Henry Miller since before Caleb was born. He had fixed wells, cut hay, branded cattle, buried animals, and once long ago helped Henry build the north fence after a flood nearly took half the pasture. Mr. Whitaker was the kind of man who never wasted words. So, when he saw Caleb coming down the path with Sarah, Ethan, Shadow, a suitcase, and the look of a man who had been thrown out of his own life, he did not ask what happened. He simply stood. For a moment Caleb could not speak. His pride was hanging by a thread, and asking for help felt like swallowing broken glass. Mr. Whitaker, Caleb said at last, his voice rough. I'm sorry to come this late. The old man looked at the suitcase, then at Sarah's tired face, then at Ethan, who was trying hard not to look scared. Finally his eyes settled on Shadow. Something passed through his expression. Not surprise. Recognition. Then he nodded toward the cabin. Come in. Sarah stepped forward. We don't want to trouble you. We just need somewhere for tonight. We'll figure something out tomorrow. Mr. Whitaker turned without answering and walked inside. Caleb thought for one awful second that the old man had refused them. But then they heard him moving things. Metal tools clattered. A chair scraped across the floor. Boxes thudded against the wall. When Caleb looked through the doorway, he saw Mr. Whitaker emptying the small back room where he kept his equipment. He carried out a coil of rope, 2 rusted shovels, a broken lantern, and a crate of nails. 30 minutes later the room was bare except for a cot, a rolled mattress, and 2 folded quilts. 3 can fit in here, Mr. Whitaker said. Boy can take the cot. You and your wife take the mattress. I'll sleep out front. No, Caleb said quickly. We can't let you do that. You can and you will. The old man pointed toward the corner. Water's from the pump outside. Roof leaks near the east wall if it rains hard, but it'll hold tonight. Sarah's eyes filled. We don't know how to pay you. Mr. Whitaker looked at her, then at Caleb. You already did. Caleb frowned. I don't understand. Your father did me a kindness a long time ago, the old man said. A kindness I never forgot. The room went still. Caleb watched him closely. There was something in Mr. Whitaker's eyes that did not belong to simple gratitude. It was heavier than memory. Sadder than kindness. Like a door inside him had opened for half a second, then closed again before anyone could see what was behind it. What kind of kindness? Caleb asked. Mr. Whitaker looked toward the stove. Food's getting cold. And that was all he said. They ate beans, cornbread, and fried potatoes at a small table under a bare light bulb. Nobody spoke much. Ethan's anger had burned down into exhaustion. Sarah bowed her head and whispered a prayer so softly Caleb could only catch pieces of it. Thank you, shelter, protect us, show us the way. Shadow lay near the door, his gray muzzle resting on his paws, but his eyes stayed open. After supper, Ethan fell asleep, still wearing his boots. Sarah covered him with one of Mr. Whitaker's quilts and sat beside him for a while, stroking his hair the way she had when he was little. Caleb watched from the doorway, feeling the quiet ache of a man who could not protect his family from humiliation but was still expected to protect them from despair. Later, when the cabin had settled and the night insects began their steady song, Caleb stepped outside. The stars were bright above the dry creek. The ranch lay somewhere beyond the dark line of trees, close enough to remember, far enough to hurt. Shadow followed him onto the porch and lowered himself beside Caleb's boots. Caleb looked down at the old dog. What did you know? He whispered. What did my father trust you with? Shadow lifted his head. Behind them, inside the cabin, a floorboard creaked. Mr. Whitaker stood in the doorway, his face half covered by shadow. "Your father carried things most men couldn't carry," he said quietly. Caleb turned. "What things?" The old man looked past him toward the north fields where the ranch disappeared into darkness. "Some debts," Mr. Whitaker said, "don't die just because the man who made them does." Then he stepped back inside. Caleb remained on the porch, the words settling into him like cold rain. At his feet, Shadow's tail moved once against the wood. Slow. Deliberate. As if the old dog had been waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. The next afternoon the heat settled over Mr. Whitaker's land like a heavy hand. Sarah was inside the cabin washing their few dishes in a dented metal basin. Caleb was behind the shed mending one of Mr. Whitaker's old gate hinges, trying to keep his hands busy before his thoughts tore him apart. Ethan sat on the porch steps with his elbows on his knees, staring toward the ranch that was no longer theirs. Shadow had been sleeping near the doorway all morning. At least they thought he had. A little after 5, the old dog suddenly lifted his head. His ears moved first. Then, his nose. He sniffed the air once slow and deep, as if a voice had called him from somewhere beyond the dry creek. Ethan noticed it before anyone else. Shadow pushed himself up with effort, stretched his stiff back legs and stepped off the porch. "Shadow," Ethan called. The dog did not look back. He walked straight down the dirt path with a purpose Ethan had never seen in him before. Not wandering. Not searching for scraps. Not following a scent the way dogs did when rabbits crossed the brush. This was different. This was memory. Ethan stood. "Dad?" Caleb did not hear him at first. The hinge scraped under his file. "Dad," Ethan said louder, "Shadow's leaving." Caleb looked up just in time to see the old black dog cross the flat stones of the dry creek, moving toward the low hill beyond it. "Shadow," Caleb called. The dog kept going. Caleb wiped his hands on his jeans and followed with Ethan close behind. They did not run. Something about the dog's steady pace made running feel wrong, like interrupting a prayer. Shadow climbed the small rise covered in scrub brush and dry grass. His old body should have been tired by then, but he never slowed. He moved as if he had walked that path 100 times before and had been waiting for the right person to follow. At the top of the hill, the land opened. Ahead stood the barbed wire fence that marked the edge of Mr. Whitaker's property and the beginning of the Miller Ranch, the land Richard now claimed as his own. And just inside the fence line, about 10 feet beyond the wire, stood an old cedar tree. It was tall, thick, and twisted toward the east, its roots rising out of the dirt like open hands. The bark was dark and split with age. Its shadow stretched long across the ground, reaching toward Caleb like something alive. Shadow stopped at the base of that tree. He sat down. Then he stared at the dirt between the roots. He did not bark. He did not dig. He did not scratch or whine. He simply watched the ground. Ethan stepped closer, careful not to touch the fence. "Dad," he whispered, "look at him." Caleb stood beside his son, his breath caught in his chest. Shadow turned his head once and looked at them. Then he looked back at the dirt. The movement was small, but it was clear. Ethan swallowed. "He wants us to see something." Caleb gripped the fence wire, then quickly let go when a barb bit into his palm. A tiny line of blood appeared across his skin, but he barely felt it. His eyes stayed on the old cedar. His father's final words came back to him. "Take care of Shadow. Don't leave him. It's in him." Caleb's heart began to pound. "What is it, old boy?" he whispered. Shadow's tail moved once against the dust. They stayed there nearly 20 minutes. The sun dropped lower. The field turned gold. Somewhere far off a cow called from the ranch pasture, and the sound cut through Caleb like a memory of a life stolen in daylight. At last, Shadow rose and started back toward the cabin. That night, Caleb told Sarah everything. She listened without interrupting, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Mr. Whitaker sat near the stove, silent as stone, but his eyes sharpened when Caleb mentioned the cedar. "You know that tree?" Caleb asked. Mr. Whitaker looked into the fire. "Everybody who worked that ranch knew that tree." "Why?" The old man's jaw tightened. For a moment, Caleb thought he might finally speak the truth buried behind his careful silences. But Mr. Whitaker only said, "Watch the dog." The next day, at the same hour, Shadow did it again. He rose from the porch, crossed the dry creek, climbed the hill, and sat beneath the cedar until the light faded. The third day, Caleb followed him alone. This time, when Shadow reached the tree, he sat at the roots, looked at the dirt, then looked directly at Caleb. Dirt. Caleb. Dirt again. Caleb's throat went dry. The old dog was not lost. He was not confused. He had been trained. And whatever Henry Miller had hidden before he died, Shadow had just led Caleb to the first door. Caleb knelt beside Shadow under the old cedar with the north fence line cutting the land in two like a scar. On one side was Mr. Whitaker's dry pasture. On the other was the Miller Ranch, the land Richard now claimed with a signature and a smile. Caleb could see the distant roof of the big farmhouse through the trees. The sight of it still hurt, but not the way it had 3 days ago. Grief was still there. Anger was still there. But now something else had joined them. A question. Shadow sat so still he looked carved from black stone. His cloudy eyes stayed fixed on the dirt between the cedar roots, then lifted to Caleb, then returned to the dirt again. "What are you trying to tell me?" Caleb whispered. The dog's tail moved once. Ethan stood a few steps behind him, breathing hard from the climb. "Dad," he said softly, "Grandpa said it was in him." Caleb turned. The words struck him harder than they should have. "It's in him. Not near him. Not with him. In him." Caleb looked back at Shadow. Slowly he reached out and ran his hand over the dog's head, down the old animal's neck, over the rough black fur and the worn leather collar Shadow had worn for as long as Caleb could remember. It was an ugly collar. Dark brown leather, cracked at the edges, soft from age, with a rusted buckle and old stitching along the back. Caleb had never paid attention to it. Why would he? It was just a collar on an old ranch dog. But Henry Miller had paid attention. Caleb's fingers stopped near the buckle. There beneath the leather one section felt different. Thicker. Harder. Not like worn hide. Like something hidden between two layers and sewn shut by careful hands. His breath caught. "Ethan," he said, "give me your pocket knife." Ethan handed it over without a word. Caleb held Shadow gently by the neck. "Easy boy," he murmured. Shadow did not move. With slow, careful pressure, Caleb cut through the old thread on the back of the collar. He did not slice wildly. He did not rush. Each stitch came apart like the opening of a wound that had been closed for years. When the leather finally separated, Caleb saw something tucked inside. A tiny tin tube, no longer than his little finger, sealed with a small piece of wax. Ethan stepped closer. "What is that?" Caleb could not answer. His hands had begun to tremble. He pulled the tube free and broke the wax with his thumbnail. Inside were two things: a small metal key, rusted but solid, and a thin roll of paper wrapped tight enough to hide inside the tube. Caleb unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting stopped his heart. It was Henry's. Cramped. Slanted to the right. Uneven in places, as if the old man's hand had shaken while writing it. Caleb had seen that handwriting on feed receipts, fence plans, Christmas cards, and notes left on the kitchen table. But never like this. He read the message once. Then again. Then a third time, because the words seemed too heavy to belong to this world. "The old cedar by the north fence line. 4 steps north of the trunk. About 1.5 feet deep. The key opens the box only for you, Caleb. Guard what you find and understand before you act. There is a debt that must be paid, and I did not have the courage to pay it while I was alive. Forgive me, son. Your father." The wind moved through the cedar branches above them. Ethan said nothing. Caleb stared at the note until the ink blurred. Not because he could not read it, but because suddenly his father was alive again in every crooked letter. The same father who had taught him how to mend a fence. The same father who had died with fear in his eyes. The same father who had left him an old dog when everyone else thought he had left him nothing. Shadow leaned forward and licked Caleb's hand once. Caleb closed his fingers around the key. "Thank you, old boy," he whispered. The dog lowered himself back to the dirt as if his work for that day was done. Caleb looked at the tree. 4 steps north. About 1.5 feet down. Somewhere beneath that hard earth was a box his father had hidden. A box meant only for him. A box tied to a debt so old Henry had carried it to his grave. Ethan's voice came out small. "Are we going to dig?" Caleb looked toward the ranch house in the distance. Then at the note. Then at Shadow. "No," he said quietly. "Not tonight." Ethan frowned. "Why not?" "Because if your grandpa hid this for years, we don't touch it like fools in daylight. And if Richard finds out Shadow let us here?" Caleb did not finish. He did not need to. Ethan understood. Caleb folded the note, placed it inside his shirt pocket, and held the key so tightly its rust bit into his palm. "We come back before sunrise," he said. Behind them, Shadow rose slowly and began walking home. This time, Caleb followed him with a different kind of fear. Not the fear of losing everything. The fear that he was about to learn why it had all been taken in the first place. Before sunrise, Caleb woke to the sound of Shadow standing beside the door. The cabin was still dark. Sarah and Ethan were asleep in the back room, wrapped in borrowed quilts, their faces softened by the kind of sleep that only comes after too much pain. Mr. Whitaker sat in his chair near the cold stove, hat tipped low over his eyes, but Caleb knew the old man was not really sleeping. Shadow gave one quiet breath through his nose. Caleb understood. He dressed without lighting the lamp. He slipped Henry's note into his shirt pocket, took the small rusted key, and reached for the shovel leaning against the wall. Ethan opened his eyes. "You're going without me," he whispered. Caleb froze. For a moment he wanted to say yes. He wanted his son to stay inside, to remain a boy for one more morning. But Ethan was already sitting up, pulling on his boots, his face pale and determined. Caleb looked at him and saw himself at 14. "All right," he said softly. "But you do exactly what I tell you." They left before the first bird called. The world outside was gray and cold. Mist clung low over the dry creek. Their footsteps made almost no sound as they crossed the stones and climbed the hill behind Shadow. The old dog moved slowly but not uncertainly. Every step had purpose. Every pause felt like memory. When they reached the cedar, the sky was just beginning to lighten in the east. Caleb unfolded the note one more time. 4 steps north of the trunk. He measured with his boots. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then he pushed the shovel into the ground. The top layer was hard-packed by years of heat and rain. Caleb had to drive his boot down on the shovel blade to break it open. Ethan held the flashlight low, shielding it with one hand so the beam would not carry far across the fence line. After a few inches, the soil changed. Caleb stopped. It was softer underneath. Looser. Not fresh but different. Earth that had once been disturbed and put back carefully by a man who knew how to hide his work. Ethan saw it too. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Somebody dug here before." Caleb did not answer. He kept digging. At about 1.5 feet down, the shovel struck metal. The sound was small, dull and final. Ethan sucked in a breath. "Dad." Caleb dropped to his knees and began clearing the dirt with his hands. Ethan did the same. They worked carefully now, scraping around the edges until a dark metal box appeared beneath the roots. It was roughly the size of a shoebox stained by moisture, wrapped in old wire, heavier than it looked. Together, they lifted it from the ground. Shadow sat 2 steps away watching without moving. Caleb wiped the lid with his sleeve. His hands were shaking so badly he almost dropped the key before he found the lock. The rusted metal resisted at first. Then with a stiff turn it gave. The lid opened with a long tired creak. Inside was a folded piece of rough cloth. Caleb pulled it back slowly. First came a thick envelope yellowed with age. Beneath that a bundle of old papers tied with faded string. And at the bottom a small leather pouch. Ethan reached for it. "What is this?" Caleb nodded. The boy untied the cord and poured the contents into his father's open palm. Gold coins. Not many. Maybe 12 or 15. Old, heavy and warm-looking even in the weak blue light before dawn. One side carried the shape of an eagle worn soft by time. The dates were almost impossible to read, but the shine remained deep and quiet, as if the coins had been waiting underground with their own hidden heartbeat. Ethan whispered, "Grandpa left us treasure." Caleb stared at the coins. Then he looked at Shadow. "No," he said slowly. "He left us proof." He put the coins back into the pouch, then lifted the envelope and the papers. The documents were fragile, their corners curled, their ink faded but still alive. Caleb did not read them there. Not beside the fence. Not with Richard's ranch sitting close enough for a man with binoculars to see movement near the cedar. He wrapped everything again in the cloth. Then to Ethan's surprise, Caleb placed the empty-looking box back into the hole. "What are you doing?" Ethan whispered. "Covering our tracks." "But the box?" "We take what matters. We leave no sign that we found it." Ethan understood. They filled the hole, pressed the dirt flat, scattered dry leaves over the spot, and stepped back until the ground looked untouched. Only then did Caleb gather the bundle against his chest. For the first time since Henry died, he felt the truth near him. Not clear, not safe, but near. Shadow Rose turned toward the cabin and started home. Caleb followed with the papers, the coins, and the letter held tight beneath his coat. The old dog had not been a joke. He had not been pity. He had been a guardian. And whatever Henry Miller had buried with that box, it was powerful enough to make a greedy man afraid. That night Caleb waited until the cabin went completely quiet. Sarah had fallen asleep beside Ethan in the back room, one hand resting on their son's shoulder, as if even in sleep she was afraid someone might take him too. Mr. Whitaker had gone outside to sit on the porch, his old chair creaking softly beneath him. Shadow lay at Caleb's feet, his tired head resting against the floorboards. The only light came from a small oil lamp on the table. Caleb placed the old papers in front of him. For a long moment he could not open the envelope. He had spent his whole life believing his father was a hard man, but an honest one. Henry Miller did not waste words. He did not cheat at cards. He paid his workers on time. He believed a fence should stand straight, a handshake should mean something, and a man should answer for what he did. But now Caleb stared at the letter in his father's handwriting and felt the ground shift beneath everything he had ever believed. Finally he opened it. The first lines were strong, almost steady. But as the letter went on, the writing grew smaller, weaker, as if Henry's strength had drained into every word. "Caleb, my son," it began. "If you are reading this, then Shadow did what I trained him to do. And you had the patience to listen to him. That tells me you are still the man I hoped I raised." Caleb swallowed hard. Shadow lifted his eyes, then lowered them again. The letter continued. "Henry wrote about a man named Solomon Brooks, Not a stranger. Not a hired hand. His best friend. They had grown up together, worked together, dreamed together. When they were young men they bought the land side by side. Each paid half. Each owned half. The original deed Henry wrote carried both names. The ranch had never belonged to Henry alone. Caleb looked at the bundle of papers on the table. With shaking hands, he untied the faded string and unfolded the first deed. There it was. Henry Miller. Solomon Brooks. 2 names. 2 owners. His breath caught in his throat. For 30 years Caleb had walked that land thinking it was only Miller land. His father's land. His family's land. But half of it had always belonged to another bloodline, a family erased so completely no one had even spoken their name at the dinner table. He kept reading. Henry wrote that Solomon had been good with numbers, papers, and business. Henry had been good with animals, dirt, and work. Together they had been building something neither man could have built alone. Then came Richard. Caleb stopped breathing when he saw his brother's name. Richard had been only 12 years old then. Just a boy. But according to Henry's letter, poison had already taken root inside him. Richard told Caleb's grandfather Arthur that Solomon was secretly planning to sell his half of the ranch to a buyer from the city. It was a lie. A simple lie. A child's lie. But Henry believed it. He went to Solomon in a rage. He did not ask questions. He did not listen. He accused his best friend of betrayal, and when Solomon denied it, Henry attacked him. The fight ended near the old stone water trough. Solomon fell backward, struck his head on the sharp edge, and never truly rose again. 3 days later Solomon Brooks was dead. Caleb's hands went cold. The room seemed to shrink around him. Henry had not stopped there. In fear, shame, and weakness he let a young attorney help him change the property records. Papers were altered. Names were removed. The ranch became Henry's alone. Solomon's wife Rebecca left town with their 6-year-old son Harris. Henry tried to tell himself he would one day make things right. But years passed. Cowardice hardened into silence. Silence hardened into ownership. And ownership became the lie Caleb had inherited without knowing it. Then came the final wound. Years later Henry had asked Richard about that old accusation. Richard looked him in the eye and said it was true. But Henry knew by then it was not. He knew because of the way Richard smiled. Small. Quiet. Victorious. Richard had invented the lie so that one day the whole ranch would belong to him. Caleb lowered the letter. For a long time he could not move. The gold coins were not treasure. They were Solomon's. The papers were not history. They were proof. And Shadow had not guarded a gift. He had guarded a confession. Caleb bowed his head over the table, his father's letter trembling in his hands. Pain rose in him, sharp and unbearable, not only for what Richard had done but for what Henry had carried hidden and failed to repair while he still had breath. At the bottom of the page, Henry had written one final plea. Find whoever remains of Solomon Brooks's family. Return what I stole. Do what I was too afraid to do. Only then maybe I can rest. Caleb closed his eyes. When he opened them they were wet. Shadow placed his muzzle on Caleb's boot. And in the quiet cabin with the truth finally breathing in the open, Caleb whispered, God help me do this right. Caleb read that part of the letter again. Then again. Richard had been 12. 12 years old. Not a grown man hardened by money. Not a tired son fighting over land after a funeral. Not the polished stranger in city shoes who had thrown Caleb's family out before sunset. A boy. A boy with dirt on his boots, schoolbooks under his arm, and enough poison in his heart to plant a lie that would one day bury a man. Caleb could not make his mind accept it. He tried to picture Richard at 12 running through the same fields they both knew, sitting at the same kitchen table, eating the same cornbread, hearing the same father's voice call them in before dark. He remembered Richard as proud even then, sharp-tongued, always watching what other people had. Always measuring himself against the room. But this? To tell their grandfather that Solomon Brooks was planning to sell his half of the ranch behind Henry's back? To make it sound real enough to light a fire inside an honest but stubborn man? To know that one lie could turn friend against friend? Caleb felt sick. Sarah came to the table, quietly wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. She had woken when she heard his chair scrape against the floor. What is it? She whispered. Caleb handed her the letter. She read in silence. As her eyes moved down the page, her hands slowly covered her mouth. By the time she reached the part about Solomon falling beside the stone water trough, tears stood in her eyes. My God, she said. Caleb looked toward the back room where Ethan slept. Richard was younger than Ethan when he started all this. Sarah lowered the letter. Started it, yes, but your father chose what he did after. The words hurt because they were true. Caleb looked down at Henry's handwriting. That was the worst part. The letter did not excuse him. It did not hide behind grief or confusion. Henry had written the truth plainly. He had believed Richard because Richard was blood. He had confronted Solomon without listening. He had struck the first blow. And when Solomon lay dying, Henry had let fear become stronger than justice. Richard had lit the match. Henry had carried the flame. A floorboard creaked behind them. Mr. Whittaker stood in the doorway, his face pale in the lamplight. He had heard enough. Caleb looked up. "You knew?" The old man did not answer right away. He stepped inside slowly and sat across from Caleb, moving like every bone in his body had become heavier during the night. "I knew some," he said. "Not all." "You saw the fight?" Mr. Whittaker's jaw tightened. "I saw the end of it." The room went colder. He stared at the table, not at Caleb. Solomon was not a violent man. He was careful. Quiet. The kind of man who folded receipts and kept them in order. He loved that ranch, but not the way men love property. He loved it like a promise. Caleb listened without breathing. "Your father came at him angry," Mr. Whittaker continued. "Solomon kept saying he didn't know what Henry was talking about. He kept saying, 'I never spoke to any buyer.' But Henry was too mad to hear him. Too proud. Too hurt. Then Solomon fell." Sarah closed her eyes. "And Richard?" Caleb asked. Mr. Whittaker looked at him then. "I saw him that day too." Caleb's heart gave one hard beat. "He was standing by the hay shed," Mr. Whittaker said. "Not close enough for his father to notice. Close enough to see. I remember his face because it wasn't scared. A child should have been scared, but Richard just stood there watching." Caleb's hands curled into fists on the table. Mr. Whittaker swallowed. "I told myself I must have seen wrong. I told myself no boy could understand what he had caused. But years later, when your father asked me if I thought Solomon ever meant to sell, I told him no. I told him Solomon would have died before betraying him." Caleb looked at the letter again. "Dad knew." In the end, Mr. Whittaker said yes, he knew. Outside, Shadow lifted his head and gave a low whine. Caleb turned toward the door. The sky beyond the window was still black, but the first gray edge of morning had begun pressing against the hills. Somewhere beyond that darkness stood the ranch, the big house, the barns, the fields, the cedar tree, and Richard sleeping under a roof built on a dead man's name. For the first time, Caleb understood that his brother had not become greedy after the will. He had been waiting for that ranch his entire life. Waiting since he was 12. Waiting since Solomon Brooks hit the ground. And now Caleb held the one thing Richard had never planned for. The truth. By morning, Caleb Miller had not slept. He had sat at Mr. Whittaker's kitchen table until the lamp burned low, Henry's letter open in front of him, the original deed beside it, and the little leather pouch of gold coins resting between his hands like a judgment. Outside, the first light came slow over the hills. Shadow lay beneath the table, his old body curled close to Caleb's boots. Every now and then the dog's tail moved against the floorboards, soft and tired, as if he knew the worst part of the secret had finally been spoken. Sarah came in first. She had a shawl around her shoulders and worry in her eyes. She did not ask whether Caleb had slept. The answer was written all over his face. Ethan followed her, quiet, still carrying the stunned look of a boy who had learned overnight that the world could be built on lies and still look solid from the outside. Caleb looked at them both. Then he pushed the letter across the table. "I know what Dad asked me to do," he said. Sarah sat slowly. "What are you going to do?" For a moment Caleb said nothing. Because the truth was, part of him wanted revenge. He wanted to march up to the big house, throw the papers in Richard's face and watch that cold smile disappear. He wanted to tell the whole town what his brother had done. He wanted Richard to feel even 1 minute of the shame Caleb's family had swallowed on that dirt road with their belongings piled in the back of a truck. But revenge had a heat to it. And Caleb had learned something during the worst day of his life. Heat made a man careless. Richard lived in heat. Greed, anger, control, pride. All of it burned inside him. That was how he hurt people. That was how he waited for others to strike first. Caleb could not beat him by becoming him. He picked up the old deed and placed his palm over the 2 names written there. Henry Miller. Solomon Brooks. "This isn't about taking the ranch back for me," Caleb said quietly. "It never was." Ethan frowned. "But Uncle Richard stole it from us." "He did," Caleb said. "And what he did to us was wrong. But before he stole from us, this family stole from someone else." Sarah's eyes softened, though pain moved through them. Caleb continued, his voice low but steady. "Grandpa carried this for 40 years because he was too afraid to face the family he hurt. I won't carry it another day just because I'm angry." Ethan looked down at the table. "So we're just giving it away?" Caleb turned to him. "No, son, we're giving it back." The words settled over the room. Giving it back. Not losing. Not surrendering. Not being weak. Returning what never truly belonged to them. Mr. Whittaker stepped in from the porch then. He had been listening. Caleb knew it, and for once he was glad. The old man's face looked older in the morning light. "You ready to hear the rest?" Mr. Whittaker asked. Caleb nodded. They walked outside together to the stone bench near the cabin. Sarah and Ethan stayed by the doorway. Shadow followed and lowered himself in the dust between the men. Mr. Whitaker took off his hat and held it in both hands. Solomon had a wife, he said. Rebecca. And a boy named Harris. 6 years old when they left town. Caleb leaned forward. Where did they go? North first. Then I heard Rebecca died of pneumonia a few years later. Harris was sent to live with an aunt in another state. After that, folks stopped talking. Or maybe I stopped listening because it hurt too much. Caleb stared toward the dry creek. Somewhere out there Solomon Brooks had a family. Maybe children. Maybe grandchildren. Maybe someone who had grown up hearing only pieces of a story, how their bloodline once had land, how it vanished, how nobody ever gave them a straight answer. And now Caleb held the answer in his hands. I need names, Caleb said. Anything you remember. Mr. Whitaker looked at him closely. You understand what this means? Caleb nodded. It means if we find them, they may take everything. Sarah stepped closer and placed her hand on Caleb's shoulder. Caleb did not look away. Then everything will finally be where it belongs. Mr. Whitaker's eyes filled though no tears fell. For the first time since Caleb had known him, the old man looked relieved. I waited 40 years to hear a miller say that, he whispered. Caleb folded Henry's letter and placed it inside his shirt pocket over his heart. Then he stood. The ranch was still beyond the hills. Richard was still in the big house. The lies were still standing. But now Caleb had chosen his road. Not revenge. Not silence. Justice. And for the first time since his father died, he felt like he could breathe. 3 days later, a young woman stepped off the noon bus with a worn backpack, a folded map, and a look in her eyes that did not belong to a stranger. Her name was Valerie Brooks. She was 26 years old with dark hair pulled into a thick braid and simple clothes that still carried the dust of the long ride from the state capitol. She did not go to a diner. She did not ask for a motel first. She walked straight through town with the map clutched in one hand, past the courthouse, past the feed store, past the old brick church until she reached the cemetery at the edge of the road. The graves were quiet beneath the afternoon heat. Valerie moved row by row, reading names carved into stones worn smooth by years of rain and sun. Some had flowers. Some had flags. Some had nothing but weeds. Then she stopped before a small gray marker almost hidden near the back fence. Solomon Brooks. The letters were faint, but they were still there. Valerie lowered herself to her knees. For a long moment she did not move. Then she pulled a single yellow flower from her backpack and placed it against the stone. Grandpa, she whispered, her voice breaking, only once I made it. I know it took too long. But I'm here now. In that backpack were 3 years of her life. Copies of old county records. Bank receipts with Solomon's name. Letters her grandfather had written from a hospital bed before he died. Statements from people who still remembered whispers their parents had passed down. Every document had been gathered, one office at a time, one courthouse basement at a time, one clerk's reluctant answer at a time. Valerie's father, Harris Brooks, had told her the story before he died. Not the whole truth. He had not known all of it, but he knew enough to leave his daughter with one command: go back and find out why our family lost everything. So she had. What Valerie did not know was that someone was watching from across the street. Gordon Walker sat behind the wheel of his truck, his face gone pale. He had come to the cemetery for another reason, but the moment he saw that young woman kneeling at Solomon Brooks's grave, the past reached through 40 years and wrapped its hand around his throat. Within minutes, Walker was driving toward the ranch. And by sunset, Mr. Whitaker was standing in the doorway of Valerie's rented room above the old mill store. She had spread her papers across a small table. Deeds, letters, copies, notes, dates. A whole lost family trying to speak through yellowed pages. Mr. Whitaker looked at the documents and went still. Then he removed his hat. Miss Brooks, he said quietly, there's someone you need to meet. That evening Valerie walked into Mr. Whitaker's cabin. Caleb stood when he saw her. Sarah stepped beside him. Ethan stayed near the back wall watching the young woman whose family name had lived like a ghost inside their own. For a few seconds nobody spoke. Then Caleb reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out Henry's letter. Valerie stared at it. My father said there might be something, she whispered. But he died before he could find it. Caleb laid the letter on the table. Then he placed the original deed beside it. Henry Miller. Solomon Brooks. 2 names, 2 owners. Valerie pressed both hands to her mouth. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. Not yet. She looked like someone who had spent years forcing herself to be strong and had suddenly been given permission to hurt. Mr. Whitaker went outside with a shovel. 10 minutes later he returned carrying an old rusted coffee can wrapped in oilcloth. His hands shook as he set it on the table. I should have brought this out years ago, he said. Inside was another confession. Henry's confession. Signed. Witnessed. hidden away under the old pear tree because fear had kept too many men silent for too long. Valerie read it standing. Caleb watched her shoulders tremble. When she finished, she looked at him. Not with hatred. Not with accusation. With something even harder to bear. Grief. All this time, she said. My family wasn't poor because life was cruel. We were poor because someone took our ground from under us. Caleb lowered his head. Yes, he said. And I'm here to help you take it back. By midnight, the table was covered in proof. Valerie's records. Henry's letter. Mr. Whitaker's confession. The original deed. Solomon's hospital letters. Dates, names, signatures, witnesses. No shouting. No threats. No revenge. Just truth piece by piece becoming strong enough to stand in court. At dawn, Caleb, Valerie and Mr. Whitaker drove to the county courthouse together. And behind them in the back seat, Shadow rested his gray muzzle on Ethan's knee as if the old dog knew the secret he had guarded for years was finally out of the dark. By the time Caleb, Valerie and Mr. Whitaker left the courthouse, the truth was no longer sleeping. It had names now. Signatures, dates, witnesses. It had Henry Miller's confession, Solomon Brooks's deed, Mr. Whitaker's hidden statement and Valerie's years of records stacked together in one sealed file. For the first time in 40 years, the ranch did not feel like land anymore. It felt like evidence. But in a small town, truth travels fast. By sunset, Richard knew. No one ever admitted who told him. Maybe it was a clerk at the courthouse. Maybe it was a ranch hand who saw Valerie step into Caleb's truck. Maybe it was the attorney Gordon Walker, suddenly too nervous to keep his mouth shut. It did not matter. Before dark, Richard was standing alone in the big house, staring at the walls like they had betrayed him. Then he made the kind of decision a frightened man makes when greed has already eaten his soul. He called Silas Crow. Silas was a thin, hard-faced man who lived 2 counties over and did quiet jobs for cash. Richard had used him before, never for anything that could be proved. This time, his instructions were simple. Watch Caleb. Watch the woman. Find the dog. Find the papers. And if needed, take the boy. The next evening, Ethan did not come home. Sarah noticed first. She had been waiting by the cabin door, looking down the road every few minutes. Ethan had gone into town to pick up nails and coffee from the feed store. It should have taken him 1 hour. 2 passed. Then 3. At 9 o'clock, Sarah woke Caleb with a face so pale he knew before she spoke that something was wrong. By dawn, a little boy from town arrived at Mr. Whitaker's place with a folded note in his hand. Caleb opened it. The words were short. Cold. Written by someone who wanted fear to do half the work. We have the boy. He is alive. If you want him to stay that way, bring the dog and every document you found. No sheriff. No judge. No tricks. Noon tomorrow. The old river crossing. Sarah collapsed to the floor before Caleb finished reading. For 1 second the cabin broke open. Sarah cried into her apron. Mr. Whitaker reached for the shotgun he had not touched in years. Valerie stood frozen, one hand over her mouth. Shadow rose from the corner and began to growl low and broken, as if the old dog understood that the child who had followed him to the cedar was now in danger because of the secret he carried. Caleb did not shout. He did not curse. He folded the note carefully and put it into his shirt pocket. Then he looked at Sarah. I'm bringing our son home, he said. All afternoon, Caleb worked without stopping. He found an old metal box in Mr. Whitaker's shed and filled it with Smooth Creek stones until it weighed almost exactly like the real one. On top, he placed a thin layer of Solomon's gold coins, just enough to shine when the lid opened. The real documents, Henry's letter, the original deed, the signed confession, Valerie's records, went into a sealed tin can and were buried under the old pear tree behind the cabin. If I don't come back, Caleb told Mr. Whitaker, you know what to do. Mr. Whitaker's eyes filled, but he nodded. Valerie left before nightfall to reach the federal judge her contact had named. Sarah wanted to go with Caleb. He would not let her. That was the only time his voice broke. At noon, Caleb walked to the old river crossing with the fake box in one hand and Shadow wrapped carefully in a heavy blanket bundle with small air holes near the top. 3 men waited among the rocks. Richard stood in the middle. And behind him, tied by a rope held by Richard's foreman, was Ethan. His forehead was bandaged. His eyes were burning with fear and anger, but he was alive. Caleb nearly fell from relief. Let my son go, he said. First, Richard answered, show me what you brought. Caleb set the box down and opened it. Sunlight struck the coins and Richard's face changed. Greed stepped forward before he did. The papers, Richard said. When Ethan is free? Richard smiled. You never learned, did you? I give the orders now. He signaled to the foreman, who shoved Ethan forward. In that same instant, Caleb dropped the blanket. Shadow burst out barking, lunging at Silas's legs. The distraction lasted only 1 second. It was enough. Ethan tore free and ran toward the brush. Silas raised his rifle. No, Richard shouted. but the shot had already cracked across the riverbed. Caleb threw himself between the rifle and his son. The bullet tore through his right side and he dropped to his knees on the stones. Then the bushes behind the crossing exploded with movement. 4 federal officers stepped out with weapons drawn. Federal authority. Drop your guns. The foreman threw his weapon down first. Silas tried to run and was tackled before he reached the water. Richard stood frozen, staring at Caleb's blood on the rocks like he had finally seen the true cost of everything he wanted. Ethan ran back screaming, "Dad, Dad, please." Caleb touched his son's face with a shaking hand. "I'm here," he whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." And beside them, Shadow pressed his old body against Caleb's side and did not move. Caleb survived. The bullet left a scar across his side, but it did not take his life. Richard was arrested that afternoon, not as the proud owner of a ranch but as a man finally trapped by the truth he had spent his life running from. Weeks later, a judge ruled that half of the Miller Ranch rightfully belonged to Solomon Brooks's descendants. Valerie stood in the courtroom with tears on her face as the land that had been stolen from her family was returned at last. Caleb did not fight her. He helped her. And when Richard, broken and ashamed, asked for forgiveness, Caleb gave him one answer. "I forgive you," he said. "But forgiveness does not erase consequences." Richard lowered his head, and for the first time in his life, he had nothing left to take. Shadow died that winter beneath the old cedar tree. Caleb buried him there, where the secret had waited all those years. Only then did he understand his father's final gift. The dog had never been the inheritance. He had been the guide. Life has a way of hiding its greatest truths inside what others laugh at, reject, or throw away. Sometimes justice does not arrive through power, money, or revenge. Sometimes it arrives through patience, courage, and one faithful heart that refuses to let the truth stay buried. If this story touched you, tell us in the comments, would you have chosen revenge or justice? And don't forget to subscribe, because the next story may remind you of something you were never meant to forget.